Our next speaker is Vito Messina, a professor at the University of Turin, co-director of the Iranian-Italian Joint Expedition in Khuzestan, and a current Getty Villa scholar. His research interests include cultural interactions in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, focusing on Mesopotamia and Iran of the first millennium BC, new technologies, administrative procedures, and royal ideology in Seleucid and Arsacid Asia. It's rolling off the tongue now. He will be presenting on lost Hellenistic sculptures rediscovered in Mesopotamia and Iran. And while they figure out how many PhDs it takes to put the next PowerPoint up, I think 3.
Maybe present.
You will eventually, but I'll just comment that I have been live texting to graduate students who can't be here about the contents of these talks. It's been very stimulating and fun, so I'm just keeping up a stream. Not live tweeting, that would be too public, but live texting, and they're very exciting. And I get graduate student responses with things like, ooh, and cool, for graduate students working on hybridity between Egypt and the Levant, or Egypt and Nubia, primacy needs to be thrown out the window, and all of these discussions are very rich. Oh, we're almost there. And here we go. Vito, thank you.
Well, we did it. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me, first of all, I would like to thank Hidun Shayegan, the Purdawood Center and UCLA for kindly inviting me to present my very in embryo project in this very stimulating symposium. And also would like to express my gratitude to the Getty Research Institute for the incomparable opportunity of carrying on research in an environment which is as well incomparable. And in the end, also beg your pardon in advance for some infelicities that may occur in my English speaking and pronunciation. Anyhow. Famous cultural works of the Hellenistic period were very popular and appear to have had estimators at all levels in the societies of their time, to the extent that they were replicated in colossal, small, or even miniature size by works that can be found in different places and provide information on originals that are now lost. All these prototypes, we do know in many cases late copies, dated even centuries after the supposed making of the masterpieces they replicated. A phenomenon that, in the almost endless horizon of what we call Hellenism, is random at best, also very far from the supposed areas of prototypes production. However, famous works, or better, works that we are able now, today, to identify as famous in antiquity, because occurring in many copies or attributed to reputed artists like Lysippus and Praxiteles, were not the only subjects replicated by media of diverse type and size. A number of other figures also occur that we can confidently identify as statues by the presence of some distinctive elements, like, for instance, the bases, pedestals, or planes onto which they stood, or the temples into which they were placed. And we can see here 2 painted craters from Apulia, onto which a painter is at work on the Leontee of a Heracles statue, or Orestes, surrounded by the Erinyes, supplicating a statue of Athena, or again, on an engraved gem of unknown provenance, a statue of Serapis in a temple. These replicas, especially on media of smaller miniature size, like glyptic objects, coin dies, painted vases, terracotta figurines, seal impressions, statuettes in diverse materials, have been considered of basic importance for our knowledge of ancient sculpture, since systematic studies on this topic have begun. If major prototypes are now widely lost, for stone sculptures could be smashed in some actions of damnatio memoria, or bronzes melt for using the core material for other purposes, the former, I mean the small-size media, did survive down to present days in far large number. thus providing a wide panorama of iconographies and types to be analyzed. This has led scholars to conduct both general and particular studies on statues reproductions, which are of basic importance for our approach to and understanding of reproduction as a complex phenomenon. In overall works on Greek sculpture, miniature media are sometimes recalled when a major prototype is missing, while specific studies have been each devoted to a particular medium, thus offering overviews on the material used for making reproductions of major works, statues on coins, statues on gems, on painted vases, etc. And you see here two of the most famous, although dated, publications that inaugurated this field of study. In this rich production, which analyzed what is basically iconographic information, different assumptions came to the fore, and the ongoing debate also brought on contradictions and doubts. However, it emerges that processes of major works reproduction characterize the commission and making of artworks at all social levels. Given the pivotal role played by Greek art in these processes and root tradition of classical studies, scholars particularly focused on the documents found on the Mediterranean when addressing the problem, with few exceptions. The vast remaining part of what we call the Hellenistic world, you've seen that before, remain largely neglected. However, the upper satrapies of the Seleucid kingdom, namely Mesopotamia and Iran, broadly speaking, were involved in the same processes so well attested in the Mediterranean. Rather, in a supranational perspective, which we can devise based on what we know of the lasting Achaemenid experience, these processes appear as one of the most significant legacies of the interferences between the different cultures of people living in such a vast political entity. A melting pot into which Greek, Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Central Asian traditions interact, were mingled, and created a new visual language that could be comprehensible by spectators of different background. Here we have a very famous bronze gilt plaque found at Ayhanum, onto which the statue of the goddess Kybele, or Kybele Nanai, is carried on a chariot by Anike in a scene that displays Greek, Mesopotamian, and Iranian elements together. Although residual, archaeological evidence testifies that major works did exist in these regions and were made following well-known trends in endurable or perishable materials. Bronze, stone, and even clay statues are attested at different sites in Mesopotamia and Iran throughout the entire Hellenistic period. And we see here, for instance, a bronze sculpture accidentally found during military operation at Seleucia on the Tigris, which displays a slightly different version of the Farnese Heracles that we saw in the first slides of these presentations, a difference onto which we will come again soon after. Or again, a statuette found in the Parthian layers of Nineveh in the palace of Sennacherib, made in local stone, in the so-called Mosul alabaster, which displays the famous type of the Heracles epitrapezio, or a famous marble head found in Susa, at Susa in Elymais, universally but erroneously known as Queen Musa, whereas it represents clearly a thuke, or a head in clay, made in clay, found in the Parthian citadel of ancient Nisa, which show the head of one of the progonoi of the Sakid dynasty, represented as a warrior. Given the not so exhaustive knowledge we have of this phenomenon in the Seleucid domain, the project I want to start here at the Getty aims at tracing back the possible existence of major sculptural works in Mesopotamia and Iran, basing on a comprehensive study of their reproduction on media of small size, which contextualize and compare with other evidence, textual and or archaeological, iconographic information. The reproduction of statues that actually exist in important centers of these regions is provided by archaeological remains, although sporadically. We can return here to the sculpture of Heracles, which display the prototype of the resting Heracles on a club, although with an important difference, for on the Seleucia bronze, the hero's right hand rests on his hip and not on his back, which is the case of the bronze, for instance, from Naples or other small replicas. Now it rests on the hero's back for holding the apple of the Hesperides, as is well known. Now it's interesting to see that terracotta figurines that have been found and were produced in workshop of Seleucia on the Tigris exactly replicate the bronze statue from Seleucia and display so the right hand on the hip, and not the more diffused version attest elsewhere, to the extent that we can probably reconstruct the statue based on both bronze and terracotta figurines in this way. The search for small media reproducing major works will make available iconographic information. However, the latter itself and alone is not adequate for theorizing the existence of original statues or sculptures, in my opinion. What we learn thanks to iconography needs to be contextualized if possible. For contextualization increases the quality and complexity of iconographic information from which we start. A good example of contextualization could be provided by this seal impression found in a room archive of the Beit Reish sanctuary at Uruk in South Mesopotamia. As the Greek inscription Kreophulakikos on the right clearly attests, it is the seal of a Seleucid officer in charge for the validation of documents, the Kreophulaks. These officers resided in the centers where the sealed documents they validated were kept. Among others, their seals bore official Seleucid symbols or iconographies. In this case, a statue representing a heroized ruler holding a spear. The prototype is clearly that of the famous Alexandre à la lance attributed to Lysippus, of which several copies of various sizes are known. But unlike Alexander, the ruler is here bull-horned. Other impressions of Kreophulakes seals found in public archives like that of Seleucia, onto which only the head of the statue is represented in three-quarter or profile, allow us to recognize the portrayed sovereign as Seleucus I, and you can see here again the inscription Kreophulakon on the left. The head is also a test on coin dies of Antiochus I, successor and son of the former, in the frame of a program of posthumous celebration of his father and founder of the dynasty. A further example is given by another seal impression found at Seleucia. It reproduces the statue of the Mushkush, the serpo-dragon of the Babylonian god Marduk, or Bel, crouched on an altar-like pedestal. The collation of other impressions of the same seal occurring on cuneiform clay tablets allowed my distinguished colleague Ron Van Vels to read the cuneiform inscription Niga Umum, temple property of Bel Marduk, about the figure, and identify the seal of the Shatamu, the high priest and officer of Esagila, the sanctuary of Babylon, of which the statue was the symbol on this seal. Once contextualized, these seal impressions allow us to say that the existence of a statue of Seleucus I bull-horned at Seleucia and or Uruk, and of the statue of the Mushkush of Marduk at Babylon can be assumed confidently, or at least with a certain degree of reliability. In few words, to recall what I am saying, one thing is to put forward the existence of a statue basing on its reproduction on an object of which we do know the provenance, we are not sure of the date, we do not know the context, the use, as for instance a gem in a collection. Or the thing is to do that on an object of which at least we know the provenance, for instance terracotta figures of which we know maybe if they came from a workshop, from a tomb, from a house, etc. Another else is to do that on the basis of coin dies, or better, official seal impressions, for instance, of which we do know what they were used for, where, when, in which context, by whom, and how and why iconographic information they bear can be explained. If contextualized iconographic information is compared and crossed with information of other type, like textual and archaeological records, if any, the degree of reliability of our initial assumption increases. For instance, a passage from Appian's Syrian Wars refers to Seleucus' horned statues directly. And I go directly to translation here, for the Greek text is under your eyes. He, Seleucus, was of such a large and powerful frame that once, when a wild bull was brought for a sacrifice for Alexander and broke from his ropes, he, Seleucus, held him alone with nothing but his hands. And for these reasons, his statues, tous andriantas, we read in the last line, are ornamented with horns. This topos must have become quite famous in antiquity, for after some decades appears again in a passage of the Pseudo-Callisthenes, I mean in the Romans of Alexander, of course, in which it is said that a statue of Seleucus in a sculptural group, including Alexander and the other Diadokoi, was identifiable by the horns he bore. Of course, in both cases, we are dealing here with a theology, for these records post-date by centuries the period they are describing, and in my opinion, the group mentioned by the Pseudo-Callisthenes is probably fictitious. However, they contribute to the general context we are trying to define by informing us that a tradition regarding Seleucus bull-horned statues did exist and survive long after the Seleucid era, and that these statues should have been quite well known. In addition, Appian's passage allows us to postulate the reason for the presence of bull horns as a distinctive element of Seleucus I's iconography. That is, his heroic action of holding a bull with nothing but his hands. This is particularly interesting when referring to the visual language defined by Antiochus I for the posthumous celebration of his father, a language that should be comprehensible by spectators of different background. In Greek eyes, Seleucus bears bull horns on his head because he defeated a bull. Thus he wear a kind of bull exuvia, as Heracles did, wearing the leonte after having strangled the Nemean lion. This makes Seleucus as a supernatural being in the posthumous celebration planned by Antiochus. In Babylonian eyes, horns qualify Seleucus as a supernatural being directly, having been for millennia the distinctive attribute of gods and goddesses of different rank in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Furthermore, the figure of the hero defeating animals or monsters by his hands is attested in Mesopotamian and Iranian glyptic of all times copiously. Thus a message that could be visualized and acknowledged universally. But I want to go longer on this point here. That horn statues were diffused in the Seleucid domain is also proved by sporadic sculptural remains of a head, a fragmentary marble head, of which identification is still debated, but at least attests the existence of the type. Archaeological records acquired in recent years, which are still largely unpublished, will further increase the quality and complexity of information. The existence and diffusion of Al-Alans type, of which, for instance, we already know samples, like the two found in Yemen at Marib, just to quote, is provided by a study published 1 year ago by my friend and colleague Gunvor Lindström of the Deutsche Archäologische Institut. This study regards the bronze fragments of a Hellenistic statue found in the 30s at the famous sanctuary of Shami in southwest Iran, ancient Elamites, where I am co-directing a joint Iranian-Italian expedition since 2012. 3D digital models derived by laser scanner acquisition will probably help us in reconstructing the physiognomy of the represented sovereign. However, what is much more interesting for us now is that during a survey in the storerooms of the Iran-e-Bastan Museum in Tehran, other bronze fragments of these statues were found that were still unattributed. This allowed Lindstrom to restore the outstretched left arm of a life-size man holding a spear, and allow us to say that the same type of statue attested at Seleucia or Uruk has been dedicated by a Seleucid ruler into one of the most reputed sanctuary of Hellenistic Iran. Other interesting records came to the light during, for instance, our excavations at Nisa, at Old Nisa Mithridat Kert. There, we found 2 gypsum molds for a clay statue and a round, which allowed the shaping of the back legs of a horse, and allow us to say that equestrian statues, larger than life size, were commissioned and made in the context of 2nd century BC Hellenized cults like that of the Arsacids. I am thus starting what will be a lasting research here at the Getty, in multiple steps that we can resume briefly as the systematic search for documents bearing iconographic information on statues, their contextualization, if possible, for increasing the quality and complexity of information, their comparison and reference crossing with textual and epigraphic evidence, if any, and their comparison and crossing with archaeological records. I think you realize that I did speculate on this subject before and have some thoughts, but however, the real workload is yet to be done almost entirely, and it's a huge one. This is why I do imagine an off-the-shelves research with other scholars involved in the workflow, for the subject is very vast and demand continuous revisions in the light of the data we hope to acquire in future increasingly. So what I envision is the creation of a web-based open access tool that makes available to users of different level an updatable database of the lost sculptures recognized by their action on media of small size. This should allow users, on the one hand, to visualize easily the sculptures of which the existence is theorized, the rediscovered sculptures, and on the other, to contribute to the data bank, starting from iconographic evidence that is progressively acquired and processed. The visualization of the rediscovered sculptures should range from possible to certain, basing on the quality and complexity of the information acquired on a given sample, if it can be contextualized, if there are some literary references, if these are specific or generic, and so. And of course, far distant and far more important, in my opinion, as I am an archaeologist, the smoking gun, the archaeological records will allow us to be certain about the presence of some sculptures in this area. Data should be also visualized in a GIS, shaped on state-of-the-art, multi-level and multi-temporal system, like the Google Earth, just to be clear, which allow users to see the sculpture's spot distribution and certify and verify their reliability at a glance. And speaking freely, of course, nobody will take you seriously if a GIS is not included in the package. In few words, an open and updatable system that one expects can be useful for further research and different specialists. An art historian could be interested in the process of miniature reproduction itself, so as to trace the roots of a prototype, even far from its supposed place of origin, verify the endurance of a particular type, agency, and success at different social level, or compare this phenomena with those attested in the Greco-Roman world, in the Mediterranean. A religious historian could be interested in the study of statues of gods and goddesses of different panthea, their diffusion, coexistence in the same centers or even the same temples, syncretism, hybridization, and so. As for me, for instance, I am particularly intrigued by information on royal propaganda that is potentially embodied in such a research. Of course, when we are talking about statue that represents ruler. The process of major works reproduction on small-size media has very important antecedents in Achaemenid Persia, when the image of the king was conveyed thanks to downscaling and miniaturization processes. the celebrative panel of Darius I's victory and accession at Byzantium was everywhere dispatched in the regions of the empire by small stelae that replicated and synthesized what was displayed on the rock as fragments of one of the stelae found at Babylon show. The famous odious scene of the King of Kings at Persepolis, which derived from Assyrian prototypes, influenced the art of the regions of interface between Greece and Persia, and here we come back maybe in intraculturalism, thanks to the diffusion of its replicas on Achaemenid official seal also. And inspired some works like, for instance, the Nereids monument of Xanthos in the British Museum, or the famous satrap sarcophagus of Sidon in Istanbul, just to quote two of them. A synthetic form of this scene, based on the king's figure only, is recalled still under the Seleucids by the Fratadaras, local rulers of Persia who wanted to claim in this way a supposed illustrious descent from the Achaemenids on the coin they issued. Even the concept of kingship, visualized in the archetypal figure of the royal hero, the fitting animal or monsters for manifesting the supremacy of the order over the chaos, perpetuated ancient traditions down to the Hellenistic period through iconographies, survived thanks to private and official seals. And for instance, here you see a seal impression of this type on a clay cuneiform tablets dated to the Seleucid period and found again in the Bitresh of Uruk. A propaganda that, perpetuating the ancient Near East concept of Zalmu, conveyed images of the king because the image of the king, whether sculptured in the round or in relief of colossal or miniature size, actually implied the presence of the king. It was the king. This tradition lasted for millennia and filtrated through the Achaemenid experience down to the Hellenistic period. Indeed, the same propaganda was also pursued by the Seleucids, rulers of Macedonian and Iranian origin, who bore the title of Basileus on Greek in their coins and the Sharru in Akkadian on clay cuneiform barrels dedicated to local temples, and, as their Persian antecedents, had to face the complexity of a multicultural society, creating a visual language that can be understandable by spectators of different background, who would recognize the preeminence of the figure on the chariot because of its iconography if Greeks, or the royal parasol, and maybe the chariot, if Iranians, or be acknowledged of the supernatural origin of the founder of the Seleucid dynasty by a bull exuvia, if Greeks, or divine horns, if Babylonians. But this is my interest only, and maybe nobody else will share it. Thank you for your kind attention.
I apologize for my ignorance. For Vito, I'm really intrigued by your project. One question I have is whether, in addition to the interesting material you're collecting for what looks like small-scale evidence for large-scale, let's say, Hellenistic sculptures in this region, is there a break with prior traditions of a sculptural sort? I mean, are there other minor arts of an earlier phase of this sort that against which these are speaking, or is this an entirely new kind of visual phenomenon? Did that come out at all well? Do you understand?
That's right. Pass the one microphone back to Vito. Yes.
Well, of course, we can date back to the Achaemenids, as I tried to show you a few minutes ago, and I think we can go back even earlier. The reason why I think so is, for instance, that I believe that even in, for instance, Neo-Assyrian periods, there must have been some small media circulating that allowed the audience scene to arrive in some way down to the Achaemenid period. The closest parallel you can find for this scene, for instance, is a mural painting that have been found in Tilbarsip in Syria, that I exclude. It should be visible. It could be visible yet in the Achaemenid period. So that means that there was some media of small size, I believe, that exist and circulated, and that we do not have now yet discovered, maybe. And the problem of size of the figures is also intriguing, because usually in Mesopotamian tradition, statues, especially the statues of gods, because as for kings we have some exceptions, but are of small size themselves. I mean, you do not have very large scale, as far as we know, sculptures in Mesopotamian temples. Statues are usually small. Even the Heracles from Seleucia, which is not a Mesopotamian god, but I mean, in my opinion, has been made in that fashion, in that idea. This size is very small if you compare with other sculptures that we know from other parts of the world. So, yes, I believe, even if I cannot be more precise, quoting you some well-known samples that can be contextualized for periods that predates that. But if you look at the seals, it is full of these examples, for instance.